Hello and welcome to Sound and Image Lab, the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. I'm really pleased today to bring you an in-depth conversation about one of the movies that has gotten an Academy Award nomination for Best Sound this year. I'm talking about Steven Spielberg's film West Side Story. And I'm particularly delighted that all 5 of the nominees in the category this year have joined us for this conversation, and it is a pretty astoundingly accomplished group of nominees. Among the 5 of them, they have an amazing 52 Academy Award nominations. So let's dive right in. We're going to talk today with Supervising Sound Editor Brian Chumney, who is celebrating his very first Academy Award nomination for West Side Story. Todd Maitland, who is the production sound mixer on the film, and he is getting his 5th nomination for West Side Story. Shawn Murphy, the scoring mixer, who has 4 nominations and 1 Academy Award win. Andy Nelson, the re-recording mixer for the film, with his 22nd Academy Award nomination to go along with 2 previous Oscar wins for sound. And finally, Gary Rydstrom, the supervising sound editor, sound designer, and re-recording mixer on the film, who is celebrating his 20th nomination, and that goes along with his astounding 7 previous Academy Award wins for sound work. And if you're a longtime follower of these fellows, you know that especially Gary and Andy have had a very long time collaboration with Steven Spielberg. Gary's collaboration goes all the way back to the early 90s and films like Jurassic Park and Saving Private Ryan. So it was really a treat to put this team together. Steven Spielberg, obviously a legendary director and someone who has been talking for a long time about wanting to do a musical. He finally got to do it with West Side Story. But I started off the conversation by asking each one of these just legends in our business what their relationship was with the original 1961 version of West Side Story, which was directed by Robert Wise, and how that movie influenced the approach to the new film.
Well, I think like a lot of people, when I was even growing up, I was surrounded by, everyone had the album. So and the 61 movie was very popular. So for me, it was one of those, everyone, even people who didn't like musicals loved West Side Story because it was cool. And I was excited when I heard that Steven was doing West Side Story, because he can do a musical beautifully. The scary thing was, I wasn't worried, but the scary thing was, not only did he choose to do a musical, he chose to do probably the most respected and
beloved,
iconic, and probably the best music. I mean, Shawn I don't know. I think it's the best music ever written for a musical. So
and some of the most
difficult. So, I mean, that was kind of thrilling. Like, okay, we're not just doing a musical, we're doing West Side Story. So everyone kind of, tenses up and go, okay, we have to do a good job because this is, it's history. It's, this is a really iconic piece of material that you don't want to, you want to do as good a job as you can for. So that was my fear and excitement at the same time.
Here's the irony for me is that was the first film I was ever taken to as a kid in London by my older brother. And I remember it well, A, because I'd never sat in a movie theater before, and B, because, look, I didn't fully understand the story. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I was pretty young. But it was just the essence of the movie that captured me. And I said to Steven when we were working on it, this is weird because this is the first movie I ever saw. And he was sort of, taken aback by that. And so I've watched it many times over the years and never imagined that I would start to work on, that story. So when Steven first announced it, and I was just so excited because I've always loved working on musicals. I've had a lot of chance to work on different musicals over the years and have learned an awful lot. But I felt that I just had a feeling this one was going to be very special. And he and I actually got a chance to discuss a little bit about some of the experience I'd had on other musicals while we were in New York running another movie. And we talked for about half an hour about just, some of the things I'd found about the live recordings versus the playbacks and how it was, to tackle certain things. He clearly, he's an extraordinary director, but he was just amazing because he was very interested and open to listen to ideas and thoughts. And So for me, it was just going full circle back from that first sitting in a movie theater in London as a kid to actually starting to watch the new version on the screen. So it was very magical for me.
Well, my father's a sound mixer, so he always loved that movie. So I grew up with it, and then I forced my kids to watch it. They've probably seen it a good 7 or 8 times. So I was really, I always loved it. And then my first connection was really on the screen tests. So I did screen tests for Tony, Maria, and Bernardo. And at the end, and I think that Steven was actually screen testing me at the same time, because he would watch me going back and forth and muting the piano and adjusting a mic here and there. And he offered me the job at the end of that day. So it was kind of really a wonderful day. I was like in front of everybody too. It was quite lovely.
Well, it's of course, like we say, we all know the iconic classic film version. And the stories were abounding all the time. Years later, that Leonard Bernstein had seen and heard the enlarged orchestration of that version and didn't care for it. There are interviews online and stories online that talk about that. And so those of us in the music world were all familiar with this, and the opportunity to kind of jump onto a new West Side Story production where we could revisit the fantastic composition and orchestration was just a too good to be true opportunity. Knowing, I actually worked with Irv Kostal, one of the orchestrators, and knew Sid Raymond, one of the other orchestrators, and have always just regarded the score as the best of all Broadway musicals. One of the most difficult, one of the most iconic. And a lot of people's favorite. So when the opportunity came around that Steven was doing this and I could possibly record the music, I tried my best, because I've recorded a lot of scores for Steven, but this is his first musical, as we know, and wanted to make sure I was at least in the running for it. And luckily and happily, that was the case, because I had plans for doing this, as best as it could possibly be recorded and presented. And the goal was to hear things in the score and in the orchestration that were never heard before. Things that were kind of a new window on this music and a way to hear it dramatically and musically that was going to be enlightenment. A better way to hear it. I think all of us succeeded in that regard.
Shawn, I'd love to kind of just dig in a little bit more about what you were talking about, because I've read those reports as well, that Leonard Bernstein, who obviously is a composer of the film, the music for the Broadway musical and the film, obviously with lyrics by the legendary late Stephen Sondheim. I had heard that too, that Mr. Bernstein was not thrilled with the music in the film version. But can you tell us a little bit more about, do we have any idea about what he responded to in it? And then did that affect how you guys how did it affect how you approached the music for this version of the film?
Well, it did directly. I mean, the stories all go, and I wasn't there obviously, but the stories all go that, the original Broadway show was a 35, 36 piece pit band, which is a large band for a Broadway show.
And much larger than you have in Broadway pits nowadays, for sure.
Much, much larger than now. But even then it was a large band. And the orchestrations were written for that size group, 5 woodwind doublers, a small string section, a rhythm section, and so forth. When it went to Hollywood, to say it was Hollywoodized is a term that, everything got bigger. It's a big screen presentation. It was a 70 millimeter type thing, big string section, big percussion, big brass, everything got big, big, big. And I think with that, a loss came about in terms of the intimacy and the detail of the show, of the music. And I think Bernstein, a lot of the stories center around him thinking that it was overblown, that everything was just bigger than life and overblown and not so musical. Knowing this, and I think Steven, of course, knew all of this. Steven knows everything about all of his projects. The approach, even though we didn't want to throw out the baby, we wanted to have the best of the film version available to us. He asked David Newman to go back and examine both the Broadway show and the film version and excerpt the best of both. And what happened was mostly we based our recordings on the Broadway versions with a larger string section so that we fill the screen in current day, but we actually are back down to 1/2 apart when 1/2 apart is appropriate. So the woodwinds, despite the fact that we had the New York Philharmonic and a great orchestra, still, when it called for a single bassoon, it was one bassoon. When it called for a single bass clarinet, it was a bass clarinet. When it, nothing was doubled up. Nothing was made bigger other than just the string numbers to fill out the size and the voicing in the string section. So we basically, for the most part, dealt with the Broadway arrangements played by a larger orchestra to fill the screen. And in that, we were able to retain a lot of the nuances and detail that was originally written. And I think it was a great decision. Now, there are bits and pieces from the film that have been rearranged. Again, Dave Newman went in and adapted those pieces for the size orchestra. And Dave is, an expert on West Side Story and a great musician. So his work really did match up well with what we had from the Broadway show. And I think the results were really, really good. I mean, it didn't overblow the screen. It didn't sound like it was a much expanded version of the Broadway show. It sounded like, a big screen version of the Broadway show with all the detail maintained.
So before we move on and get into, I've got lots of questions about Todd for you about production capture and whatnot. But before we move on, Shawn, I think this is the first time in all the years we've been doing this podcast that we've had a scoring mixer on the show to talk with us. And I can't think of a better instance or a better one to have on, but maybe for some of our audience who might not be familiar with that role, can you talk a little bit about what you do as the scoring mixer?
Sure. Well, my part in it basically was to take the music from the original inception of the recording process, which was choosing the venues for recording, choosing the crew for recording, which was going to be done in New York, choosing the people I was going to work with in recording and post-production, specifying, aside from the venue, specifying the setup, specifying the microphone choices, specifying the recording format, and then basically being in charge of all of the recording and supervising the dialogue recording pre-records that was then handed over along with Todd's recording for post-production. Because in a musical, everything gets pre-recorded no matter what, whether it's going to be used or not. So basically in charge of all the music recording from beginning to end. And I was lucky enough to stay with the project straight through editorial, straight through mix downs that went to Andy and Gary, and any notes or tidying up of mixes we could do together, because I was in a room in the same building with them doing my mixes. So it was basically the ability to kind of carry the whole project from beginning to end in the music department. The interesting reason why I'm here today is because the Academy has changed the nuance of the Sound Award, and by combining the Editorial Award and the Mixing Award into one. And that gave the sound branch an opportunity to look at the participation of various people in the sound team and to submit the possibility of their nomination or their involvement in the Oscars, if they were a scoring mixer, or perhaps if they were designed special sound effects, or if they did some sort of special contribution to the project, they could be included. So this is really the first time I'm aware of that a scoring mixer actually has been nominated as a scoring mixer.
Todd, I want to turn to you for just a minute. I feel like you've become Mr. Musical, and in fact, you were just on this podcast. It feels like just a couple months ago when we had Lin-Manuel on talking about Tick, Tick, Boom, which was another just a fantastic film this year. But I have a feeling that West Side Story was particularly challenging in terms of size and scale for you. A lot of big numbers with a lot of people on screen, a lot of mics, I'm sure. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached it and what were some of the specific challenges? I know you also had a lot of fun experimenting with microphones on this film.
No, so this is my 11th musical, and without a doubt, the granddaddy of them all. There's, just so many characters. The moment that I read that script, I was like, there are 22 characters, and they're singing, fighting, talking, jumping. They're not your normal sit around a table kind of scene. So I realized right from the beginning that I was going to have to actually put together a brand new sound cart. So we built from the ground up a cart with 30 channels of wireless, where I could have all sorts of outputs going in all sorts of different directions and different mixes for different people. and in New York City. So it's pretty much the idea is that we really recorded a Broadway show on the streets of New York. So that's how we had to prepare for it. And with Steven, there's no room for error. So you really want to double and make sure you do everything properly. So that was the first part, was getting all of that together. And then the great thing is, obviously, is that Gary and Andy were on beforehand. And we had conversations well in advance. And we even wrote Steven a letter, because we all love the sound of a boom microphone more than a lavalier. So, for some of these singing pieces, we really wanted to do them on booms. And we wrote Steven a letter saying that we would love to, on these certain moments, be able to get the boom into the shot and then paint it out. And Steven wrote us back and said, there'll be no booms in the shot. If you have to put a lavalier in there, we can put a lavalier in, which we did only once for the scene where Tony's singing as he's climbing the fire escape up to Maria. That's the only time we had one on there. And the reason they let us do it then is because they had a safety rope on his back anyway, so they had to CGI that out. So one of the things, as you alluded to, is our microphones. And I've realized that lavaliers sound very different on every different actor. So what I do now before I start any film is I take an actor, have them come over to me, in particular on a musical, and I'll set up 7 different brands of lavaliers all at chest height. And I'll have my 416 boom microphone overhead, which I find closely mimics a studio microphone. And I'll have the actors sing through it, and I'll record them, and then I'll go back and I'll A/B them later. I'll find out which lavalier sounds the best on them, which matches the boom, and then that lavalier will follow that actor from all the way from vocal pre-records all the way through post-production. So it creates a real unity, and the whole idea of this movie is to make it real. Movies nowadays or musicals nowadays are not what they were even in the 80s. In the 80s, musicals were really, everybody still accepted the idea of canned singing. When it came time to sing, it was going to be lip sync. But now it's all about reality. So in creating that reality, you have to be able to transition from speaking on set to singing. And whether it's going into live singing or into pre-recorded singing, if it's pre-recorded singing, that's why one of the reasons we would do that lavalier test. So now in the vocal pre-records, they would record with the boom, with the lavalier, and with the big studio microphone, which gives Andy the choice then to maybe start the vocal scene with the lavalier, which I used on set, and then segue into the big studio microphone. So that was one of the great transitionary things that we did for it. We also did all these great Foley tracks for Gary. My goal is always to give post-production as much as I can give them. And I love hiding microphones. We'll put microphones. My team, like Jerry and Terrence, they are running microphones. If they see a sound, we have 4 microphones that are rigged just to go get sound effects. If we see a car over there, it's like run over and get that car. If there's kids playing over there, they throw one over there to get that. So we're always laying down all these tracks, which Brian has had to, mercifully go through. But then also one of the things we'll do is we'll try to do a Foley track that's in sync with the music. So for instance, after the big dance scene in the gym, we gave all the actors headphones and little earpieces and had them do the entire scene over again so we could capture all their dance steps, all their little yells to each other, and the actual ambience of the place. So it really gives you like an in-sync Foley track that now you can bring in, and we try to record it with a lot of different microphones with different perspectives so that really gives Gary and Andy as much artillery as possible. And that's really my goal, is to give them really as much as I possibly can. And obviously do everything as clean as we can. So we everybody was wired all the time. We boomed everybody all the time. People wore earwigs. So just one of the other things quickly is that Steven would want to go from, if we were doing a scene, he would want to start and he would do the first couple takes to playback. And then he would say, okay, I want to go live. So transitioning on set to go from playback to live is a whole different thing. So it would be back to the earpieces in, microphone placement, and all of that. And we had it down to like within 2 minutes, we could go, okay, we'd go from playback to a live and then go back to playback again, or whatever Steven wanted. So it was always on our toes, always, trying to create answers and always trying to get the best tracks, and as many tracks as possible.
That is truly amazing. So then, Brian and Gary, so you're getting all this stuff in, and you've got pre-records, you've got live on set singing, you've got pre-record lip sync on set. It sounds like just an extraordinary amount of material to kind of get through. And I'm just talking about obviously the musical numbers.
Yeah, Brian. Luckily, Brian dealt with that.
Well, I mean, it was me, and it was Marshall Wynn, and it was Rich Quinn and Marilyn McCoppin. I mean, we had a great dialogue team that really were able to go through all this stuff and organize it. And it was there was never a situation where you couldn't find what you were looking for in Todd's tracks, right? It was like you knew it was there. It was just you just had to find it sometimes because there was a lot. But man, everything was so well organized and so easy to work through. It really is a pleasure to work with what Todd does. It's just having the time to go through and do it.
So Brian and Gary, you guys are co-sound supervisors, and obviously Gary, you're the re-recording mixer. Presumably you focused on sound effects and Foley and the re-recording. How do you guys collaborate, and what's the nature of the swim lanes between the two of you?
Well, in our case, it breaks down, in terms of focusing on the track. Brian is dialogue ADR, and I do focus on the sound effects and Foley, and then together we kind of put together our crew. So that's a nice way to break it down. So I do the non-pretty part of the soundtrack. But yeah, it was great. It's a great collaboration to kind of, because this movie was so, what Todd was talking about. I think the most remarkable thing in this movie is you never for 1 second don't believe that the singing you're hearing or the acting you're hearing is not happening on that set. It feels completely believable at every time. It seamlessly goes in and out of the music, and it's just a wonder. I've never heard a musical be that seamless before. I think that's one of the great achievements of this particular movie. And that's, and my part was try to add the, I guess what I find interesting about this movie is it does combine kind of a naturalistic, realistic style, which is what I could bring with ambiances and sound effects, and the stylistic style of singing, which is not natural, and the music, which is not natural. And I like that combination of kind of the gritty natural side to it and the ephemeral musical stylized side to it. I love that combination in this movie.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because it was something I wanted to ask you guys about. I feel like there's always in movie musicals kind of this tension between, movies and cinema, which is a very literal, you've got real actors and real sets in real, doing real things. And then suddenly they break into song, and there can be this sort of like tension, but I never felt that with West Side Story. And so it's just a remarkable achievement, obviously starting with Mr. Spielberg and then the performances that he captured, but also through every aspect of the sound work. And I wanted to ask you, Gary, sort of about tone. Shawn was talking earlier about the 61 version, and it's 70 millimeter, and it starts with those beautiful overhead helicopter shots of the west side of New York City. Obviously, they're iconic, and I don't want to knock that movie at all because I grew up loving it. But obviously, this movie takes a very different approach. And so I wanted, Gary, if you could just talk to us about the opening of the movie and the tone and how you use sound design to set the tone for this world that we're going to spend the next 2 hours in.
Well, so much of what succeeds, I think, in this movie was set up from the script, from the story that Spielberg and Tony Kushner put together. And one of the changes one of the details they came up with was to start with a demolition. So, the first image we have is of the neighborhood that's going to become Lincoln Center being demolished. So you set up that our characters are living in a part of New York City that's going away. And it just adds this great tension. And it's great for me because, the first sounds I get to do is not just city, but a city getting knocked down, old buildings getting knocked down, wrecking balls and such. And it gave me a great opportunity later on when we're in Rita Moreno's shop with Tony, we hear, demolition going on outside the window. We never see it again, actually, after the first scene. But it's there. That there's this undercurrent of the world, the underfoot is disappearing. So that was a brilliant idea. So generally, my job was to make it feel like 1957 New York, but a certain part of 1957 New York that was undergoing change. And I, at the same time, and I'll point out one of the both difficulties and fun things for a sound effects person to work in a musical. So I get to do wrecking balls, right? In the beginning of this movie is great, but there's also this iconic music happening, which is very, in the beginning, the opening is very, got some holes in it and other, but it's got little detailed percussion and stuff you want to hear. So I've got to do wrecking ball deconstruction and still get out of the way of the music. So that was the challenge for me for the whole movie, was to put in the reality of the city, but work within the rhythm and the sound of the music so I don't get in its way.
Yeah, I think one of the things you also, Gary, is that like even in the very beginning when they're tossing paint cans, as they're doing everything, there was so much of this movie that was choreographed, and sound effects follow that choreography like that. Yeah, they would wear earwigs like all the time on set, so we could try to capture as many as we could on set. And then Gary would obviously recreate, everything that we couldn't get there. But a lot of those sounds are choreographed.
Yeah, the rhythm of the action is really important. And we actually even in the final, we had Steve Bissinger, who was our lead sound effects editor. Even up to the very end of the final, he would micro synchronize our sound effects so that they worked with the music. So that, those paint cans and other things throughout the movie, everything was just aligned like that.
Well, that was a great thing about Steve as well, because he's a musician as well as a really great musician as well as an effects editor. So he could bring the musicality to his editing and really, really made it special.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Shawn and Todd, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the pre-records, because it seems like that's such a huge element of West Side Story in particular. And one of the questions I had when I'm watching this film is, I know that there's, Andy's doing this kind of amazing job of diving back and forth between live singing and pre-records, but then you've got a song like Cool, which is these characters really like, playing keep away with a gun, and they're running and jumping and kind of bouncing all over the place. And so how do you pre-record that on a, presumably on a a very antiseptic music, a sound environment in a recording stage, but kind of have that essence of the performance so that you enable Andy to be able to move back and forth between what he's going to what you captured live on the set versus the pre-record?
Yeah, well, Todd's already mentioned that we recorded all of the vocals with multiple microphones, and we were, and just like Todd said, we were careful to use similar or the same boom mic and lavalier mics along with a studio mic. Knowing that, there wasn't just one pre-record session. A lot of these songs were recorded multiple times, and what I have to do is mention our vocal producer Janine Tesori as part of this, because Janine trained all these actors. She was in on the audition process, and she trained all the vocalists, and I think got great performances out of all of them. These actors are singing their own parts. There's nobody singing for them other like they're in the previous West Side Story. So the performances had to be good, and we knew that in Cool, which is a very complicated number, both musically and cinematically, that we're going to be it's going to be a combination. It's going to be some studio mics, a lot of production is going to be mixed in, and it's going to be handed to Andy in a kind of a checkerboard system where he gets to choose once he looks at the picture and decides what to use. Obviously, a lot of the shouting, a lot of the motion, a lot of the vocals had to come from production. They couldn't really be pre-recorded, although the melodic material possibly could be. And we had an editor working with us in the music department, David Channing, who put together the vocals really in just a kind of wonderfully artistic way, where he would build these checkerboards of different sources, both from pre-records and from production, so that we could give it to the music editors and to Brian for the final dub, and they would have the best choices for putting the number together. Yeah, complicated, and certainly, you think of pre-records just going into the studio for one take. Some of these songs were pre-recorded a half a dozen times or more before we got the final performances that were going to be the best to use.
And there was a lot of rehearsal. I mean, Stephen did a ton of rehearsal. I would sit in on those rehearsals and they would work out the timing of everything. And then that was actually the first scene that we shot of the movie. So that was my introduction to Steven Spielberg filming, was Cool. And Cool encompassed everything from every element of playback to earwigs to wirelesses to booming to effects to everything was in that whole piece. I'm like, okay, this is what I'm in for. Strap on, 78 days of go. And it was.
Yeah, Cool was literally very cool to do because it did. I mean, for a start, it was mainly choreography. That was the thing that was great about it. So it started off with the guys all settling down. Ansel was speaking, and started to sing. So the thing was that, like all the other sequences, he'd been recorded naturally on set up to the point when we went into the playback for his vocal. Sometimes we were in a live situation onto the vocal, sometimes we were in a playback, depending. This one, I think, was in a playback situation, if I remember rightly. And but again, with the microphone choices, I was able to always utilize exactly the same microphone that had been used in the dialogue sequence up to that point in time. The studio mic, the Fat Studio mic, was really obviously more for the sort of album sound, if you like. But obviously what I was always relying on was the lavaliers or the shotgun boom mic, whichever worked to match in perfectly. And but there was only a couple of lines of sung in Cool, because then it goes into a dance. So again, the atmosphere that was created when we first cut to the guys running down to start that scene, Gary Rydstrom had already brilliantly created the sounds of the water and just the air, the openness of the wind blowing, the sheets blowing, things like that all created that lovely sound. Then when they got onto the wharf area, of course, there was the floor, the creakiness of the wood floor and so it was a question of never letting that die just because vocals came in. We kept it very strong and full, knowing that it was going to go into a full-on choreography piece. And but it was interspersed with some shouted words here and there from the original takes on production. But it was just a great dance piece, really. In the end of the day, it was just about getting that threat and the feeling of the guys throwing the gun back and forward between themselves and almost teasing Tony at times, but keeping it. It had an edge to it, and I loved it. And it built and built musically, and then went down to very, very quiet right at the very end when they basically all left him one by one at the very end of the sequence. So it had this wonderful build of very quiet at the beginning, full on dance, loud music, back down to a very, very quiet end, which I thought was a wonderful piece. Yeah.
And one thing Andy fought hard for was time to premix the vocals and premix the music, which is usually we don't have time for. And so we did our dialogue premix, and then immediately into that, he went into his vocal premix. And so he was premixing the vocals right into the dialogue, to make it, that's really how he was able to, have the time to make it as seamless as it was.
And I'll get one more thing. I'll get delivered to me on set because I'm playing the vocals back to the actors. Normally, music pre-records, they want to add a little reverb in, they want to sweeten them up a little bit in that. And I have them take all of that out. So I get dry tracks on set, which enables me to match as best that I can to what it sounds like in the pre-records. So I can reverse, back end it that way, where I can try to match the pre-records as well as they're trying to match me.
Right. Well, you can imagine these pre-record sessions, which we built in New York, like for America or for Cool, sessions involving 60 to 100 tracks of pre-records that then Todd will kind of whittle through and decide what is best going to work for them to perform to. So yeah, complicated pre-record sessions.
Todd, it sounds like you must have spent hundreds of hours in preparation for almost every hour that you spent on set recording, in production. It just sounds like a staggering amount of work. I want to ask you, I love this sequence so much. Talk to me about America and recording that and being on the street on the day, and what an extraordinary number.
I mean, from the filming of its side, it was really pretty much all playback, you know, because we had so many dancers and we had so much life on the streets. One of the things in New York is you're restricted by sound levels. So we would use up to 20 small speakers on battery powered small speakers that we would hide all over the place, because you can't just blast the music like the old days. You know, now you have to like really kind of confine it. But now we're doing these big scenes, you know, these big dance numbers, you know, with 50, 100 dancers, and surrounding them with sound as much as we can. But the energy was just incredible. You know, I mean, it is it's one of the drivers in the movie, but to see it in real life and to see all that, and their dancing and the quality of dancing and the energy of the song was just amazing. I mean, I can only imagine what the recordings were like.
Well, I'll say that during the mix, Brian will remember, I think we watched that scene more than any other scene. In some ways, it was kind of a pick-me-up, like, yeah, you know, and Steven would say, why don't we watch America? So, you know, it's kind of a, you know, amphetamine to, if you're working on something, just watch that scene, you kind of, you know, kickstart yourself and, you know, get back into your job, into the movie. Because it was just thrilling to watch. It was so nicely, I mean, Justin Peck, the choreographer, and the costumes, you know, the color of the costumes, just it was a fun scene to do. It was a fun scene to watch over and over again, because it gave us energy.
You know, in the pre-records, more than any other, you know, you have to hear every word of that piece. You know, that's one where there's a lot of storytelling going on. So when we were editing and mixing, pre-mixing the pre-records to give to Andy, we wanted to make sure we had everything super clear and well balanced, and so that the track worked well with the vocals, because you don't want to, you just can't cover up the words on that one.
No, and another thing that you do also to help make it sound real is in those pre-records, staying with the actors and reminding them what they're physically doing in the scene. Because if they're dancing or fighting or doing something in that scene, it should sound like that. There should be that kind of energy. It shouldn't just be standing in front of a mic in a studio. There should be that kind of energy behind it. So it's really important to keep that, you know, always in their mind while they're doing these vocal pre-records.
That scene has one of my favorite moments of synchronizing the action on the scene with the music. When Anita starts to sing America, she's pulling a laundry line. And the pulling of the laundry line is in perfect sync, thanks to earwigs and everything else, to what she's singing. And so we put our sounds in. Our little squeaky laundry line almost becomes part of the rhythm section of the song. I just, you know, I relish those things.
There were so many of those. You had so many, Gary.
Yeah, we enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Because again, once they're ending in the city, and there's everything comes to life around them, right? That Gary and our Foley team added, and even like Loop Group when they're going through the market, the Puerto Rican market. You know, there's all these little beats of the city alive behind them in America. That's really,
Gary, I always love talking with you about tone. It's one of my favorite things, and I think you approach your work as a director, because of course you have been a very successful director in the past, and I think you really think of it as a storyteller. And I want to ask you about the rumble. The rumble it's shocking when the scene comes in, and it's shocking because it needs to be. It's a very disturbing, violent scene, and then we go into I Feel Pretty. So I was really curious about your approach to, like, how did you thread the needle of having the rumble be as impactful as it needed to be, but not going too far, because you can't capsize this ship, you know, because the audience is going to go on a pretty big tonal shift in the next scene.
It is more violent than other versions of that we've seen in the past. Because you believe it has the realism of a movie, and you believe the punches and the knife fight are really happening. Also brilliant, like a lot of things, we depend on decisions made before we start. So the salt shed location was a great location. Is the emptiness of it, the salt, which almost looked like snow, the car lights going by in the windows, which gave us a chance for, you know, sort of the city going outside, but we had this isolated space with this big echo reverberation possible in it. And, you know, so we treated the sound effects for that very realistically. It was a real movie fight with knives and punches and things, and also made use of the fact that in this story, Bernardo is a professional boxer and Tony nearly killed a guy and went to jail. So I go, okay, these two guys can fight.
Right.
But the tone is important. You're right. If it was choreographed as kind of in the 61 movie, the fight it feels almost like a dance fight. Then I would have done different kind of fight sounds. But this is a realistic fight, the way it's shot. So they're realistic punches. We actually worked a lot on the sound of the punches, so you don't go too far. You find the right thing that's brutal, but not Indiana Jones. You know what I mean? It's not exaggerated. What saves us in some ways from it being, because you're right, we go into I Feel Pretty, which I'll point out in the stage version of this, if I understand it right, the intermission came between the Rumble and I Feel Pretty, so you had time to
the audience can kind of decompress
you
after
decompress
the Rumble,
from the killings, and then you come into this exuberant beginning of the second act. We didn't have that. So, but what makes it work tonally is the music, the Bernstein music during, when Bernardo's being punched and nearly killed, the music is incredibly violent, and I'm doing a realistic punch, but the music is still telling us that stylistically this is a musical. This is bigger than life. And then the music, as it always does, then it resolves into church bells. And the church bells, I think, become really important to take us out of this and just let us kind of soak in what just happened. And I like that I Feel Pretty followed. We struggled with the sound transition to make sure it wasn't abrupt, and we took out the reality sounds and let the church bells take us into the department store scene. But I like that I Feel Pretty now has this undercurrent of they don't know what just happened. So I Feel Pretty, which can be a scene which is, some people think, just kind of light and artificial, but it had this undercurrent to me that I thought was really effective because it was so close to that tonally brutal fight. And I find that I Feel Pretty works great coming right on the heels of the Rumble. I enjoyed that undercurrent of dread.
In terms of the Rumble itself, the biggest component that was added to that, which was just the fact that the exterior carbis were added in. Even though you see the lights, they were played fairly soft, but actually in the end, Steven wanted them quite intrusive, and that was really interesting because it gave an extra tension to the scene for sure. Again, in that sequence, even though the music that comes in is not a sung piece, therefore it would be considered background music. We never played it like that. We played it as if it was full-on score, exactly the same way as if you were sitting in the theater watching a performance. Which I think helped in some ways with the tone, because well, first of all, it kept it in West Side Story vein completely, but it allowed for it to be fairly intense and strong with the struggle and the hits and the impacts, because the music was so strong. So then we go through to the end where they all leave and run out, and we get quieter and quieter, of course. And what we did was take the atmospheres down to almost nothing, so that by the time the police arrive and they walk in, it's almost silent. And we ended up with this. There's just a church bell that rings across the sequence, and the idea was that would just take us into the next scene, because yes, it's a transition into a very different tone. But we felt that the quieter we could make the end of the sequence in the salt warehouse, that it would help that transition to go through a little bit smoother and help the tone to change. We also go into a little bit of dialogue sequence, which helps before the singing. So I think there's enough time to sort of relax and realize that you're now rejoining Maria, who has no idea of what's just gone on. And in some ways, even though it's a tonal shift, you buy the fact that she's oblivious to this and is just in her own world. And I hope we achieved that by making the end of the salt warehouse so quiet and powerful in many ways, just to see those two bodies with virtual silence. So that was our approach.
Todd, I think one of the questions I have for you, one of the things that I find remarkable about your work as the production sound mixer, is that you end up having such a remarkably intimate relationship with the actors. You and your team are working very, very closely with them. And in some ways, like, you're putting microphones on them right when they're about to go on to do their most emotional, maybe even show-stopping piece. So I just wanted to ask you about that aspect of your work, and maybe if you can talk about that in terms of Rita Moreno and her amazing performance on Somewhere, and how you navigate that very important part of your job.
It is a really important job, yeah, part of the job, sorry, because you're dealing with big personalities, and it's part of what I really like. It's probably 50% of what I really like about the business on my side of it is because I am in the middle of it, even those cold nights and all of that, where I'm questioning it, but I am in the middle of it, and I do get to see all the personalities and all of the interesting things that go on behind camera. And to me, that's 50% of it. It's always fascinating because you're dealing with such huge personalities, and when you do wire someone, and even when you're talking about their singing and you're talking about different sound things with them, whatever you have to talk about, but particularly the wiring of them is a very intimate moment. I mean, you have to put that pack on them and it's got to go somewhere. Back probably 10 years ago when we didn't wire everybody for every single scene, I would go to their trailers and I would go and stand there and go in with the wardrobe person. And it would be a 10-minute affair each time, to go through and wire them and talk them through it and all of that. Now we do it as fast as we can on set because now we wire everybody. So now we really run them through as fast as we can. So the great thing also with working with like new people, like a lot of the actors from West Side Story, they're just thrilled to be there. They don't care what the process is. They were like, run us through whatever you do. And we literally would wire them in 45 seconds. I'd have the three of us would take them like NASCAR. It was like a pit lane. They would come through. We'd drop the pack down. I always plant the microphone because to me, half of or 80% of what I do is microphone placement. If you get the microphone in the right place, it's going to sound good. If you don't get the microphone in the right place, no matter how you record it, it's not going to sound good. So it's all about that. So I'm the one who always puts the microphone on. And also the one that talks to them, at that moment. If we're singing, here's what we need to do. And then when you do other scenes where there's a lot of background noise, for instance, if you're shooting in a bar or something on a normal scene, you don't want all that noise going on when you're filming. So you play it all in the very beginning for all the rehearsals and all that. And I'll talk to the actors and say, look, this is how it's really going to sound. But you're going to be tempted to talk a lot quieter because we're going to have everybody be quiet when we actually film it. So just to keep that level up, you have to get that trust, from them. So a lot of it's a personal relationship. And it's really a lot of what I really like about it.
The somewhere moment you talked about, Glenn, is one of the moments where it's live singing too. So that's really Rita Moreno in that at the time, the way she sounded, the way that Todd mic'd her. That's why, in some ways, that's why it works so well, because the acting is so good, because that's what she did on the set at that time.
Yeah, and she's such a pro. When you approach her, she knows exactly what you need to do, and she knows exactly the reason why, it needs to be perfect. And that was really a mix between a wireless and a boom on that. So the beginning of it starts on a wireless because she was quite far away on one of the cameras. And then she walks towards us, and then right when she got to us, we transitioned to the boom, and then we followed her for the rest of the way into the scene. And one of the things I'll always do is I'll keep ambient mics going inside of a space and even outside also. So with that ambient mic, you're able to make that wireless, give it some distance. You can add some bounce of the room to it. So you can make that wireless sound like it is 40 feet away. And then as they come closer, you get rid of the ambient sound and stay more with the wireless sound, then make that quick transition to a boom. And it's pretty seamless, which is obviously the idea of everything we want to do.
The hardest part about that wasn't so much the mix, it was finding the right tone of the music, which took David Newman a little while to sort of figure out, almost just to kind of come up with it being as simple as it was, because it didn't, with that vocal and with that performance, it didn't require anything very big around it. Obviously, it does grow emotionally throughout the song, but it starts very, very quietly. And for us, I think, for Gary and myself, working with Steven on that, it was just to present something that was very honest to her and let her be absolutely front and center, even with the fragility of the vocal and the sense of and what it was meaning inside the song itself for her to sing it. So it was just a question of really calming everything down as much as we possibly could. And you can hear her walking clearly on the set, it's coming off of her microphone. We didn't try and, we just wanted to keep it honest, as if you were sitting in the front row of a theatre and watching her perform that live. And that was the sense that we wanted to try and get from that. And I thought it was beautiful. Yeah, it's a powerful moment for sure.
Gary, I wanted to ask you, I think, the day after I saw the movie, I sent you an email and said I was particularly struck by the sound design and the tone of what you were doing at the end of the film on the street outside of Doc's shop, obviously with the big confrontation with Tony. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what you were doing, because it was very subtle, but it just was so emotional and so moving.
Well, it's a stretch with no music, for one thing, not that, so I got to play. It was in contrast to the rest of the movie, which was this lively New York, and now we're taking place in the dead of night. And so the silence is what's interesting. So you hear the steam, things that they're visually in there, sort of the steam. And I got to, engage my inner Alan Splett and do some dangerously tonal, atmospheric sounds. It just made it feel empty. It's just them. The rest of New York is asleep, if it ever does. And so it is about mood. It's a chance for sound effects and ambiances to set mood too. And it was just, it sounded sad, it sounded tragic, it sounded lonely, because everyone is kind of apart. So I enjoyed that kind of opportunity. And so, yeah, but it also, it was right for the feeling of that moment. It was just, as you said, this movie changes. I mean, there's a consistent tone, but it changes. It has such a range of, exuberance to enjoy, like America or I Feel Pretty, and then Rumble. And this is truly tragic. And I love using ambiances, off-screen sounds, and just simple things that do what music can do, which is to make you feel something.
Yeah. Well said. Well, I want to wrap up. You guys have been very generous with your time, but of course, you're on the Dolby podcast, so I have to ask your favorite Dolby Atmos moments in this mix, because I thought you used Atmos remarkably subtly and effectively in this film.
Well, there's a wrecking ball moment right at the beginning. It's kind of subtle, but there's a great shot, one of that great opening shots where you got a wrecking ball kind of lifts up, and that goes right up there. I use Atmos for things like sirens and thunder. I let automatic for that. Shawn recorded with, so you can talk about how you use Atmos to kind of get a sense of the Manhattan Center, the sound of around the orchestra.
We knew ahead of time that we wanted to mic the ambient character of the room, and we recorded the New York Philharmonic at Manhattan Center, which is a famous room, 34th Street, and used a lot for orchestral recording, and it's a great sounding room. So we had, top, rear, surround mics up for all of the orchestral sessions. And I think the idea wasn't to make it very obvious, but to make it enveloping and to give Andy the chance to kind of expand and contract the sound of the orchestra depending on the scene. And I think it was very effective. I think, I don't think many people listening to an Atmos playback of the film would realize that there's a lot going on in the tops and rears and sides, but that it does affect your sense of the size of the orchestra and the space of the orchestra, and maybe it compensates a little bit for that old the 1961-62 version being where the orchestra itself was just too big and massive and congested, that we were able to make the space around our orchestra sound bigger selectively. So I think it worked well for that. And I think approaching it from the standpoint of actually having microphones up that picked that up, we didn't have to phony up the pickup. It's the real pickup of the room and the orchestra.
So the beauty of doing a musical is that when the music's there, very much so in this case with this film, it's front and center. It's never a question of underscore, which, when you're mixing a traditional dramatic movie, the music can be loud at times, it can be very soft at times, it can be very quiet underneath dialogue, and therefore you're kind of creating a world that works for that scenario. When you're dealing with a musical like this, when that music plays, it plays, and that's the fun of it. So what I was very happy to do with this one, more than any, was to utilize all of Shawn's expertise in creating the stems that would give me that flexibility. So quite often when I have material, for instance, that's for overhead mics, overhead speakers in an Atmos. Sometimes I don't always use them, or I'll keep them down a little bit, because sometimes they can have a slightly monoing effect, oddly enough, but also maybe the music has to play a little bit more of a background feel within the sequence. In this movie, it never played a background. So I was just loving everything that Shawn gave me from the all the stems, the Atmos stems, because I could play them, and I played them full out. And I utilized the corner speakers. I increased the width of the screen to utilize the corner speakers in Atmos again, but leaving the percussion, for instance, on the screen. So really, I ended up with almost like a 5-channel music mix across the screen. And then, of course, the full Atmos arrays side and back with the overheads. I mean, that's it. I mean, he gave me the material that was stunning to use, and I used it.
Let me point out with the music, you're not looking up and going, oh, there's music coming up. But what happened when we print master? So we get to the end. Here's a little sound detail. We print master. We were used to hearing Atmos. Then we go down to our 5.1, 7.1 smaller print masters. We all go, "Aw," because Andy's doing these things. He's widening the front, and then we got the top, and it goes from this space to this space, and you go, there's a magic to space and sound. That's what we listen for.
Yeah, I try, with all these, different microphones and that, and capturing different sounds. I do that with Atmos in mind, with the idea, if I can put them all on isolated tracks, that then they can maybe be pinpointed, however the guys see it fit. But it's kind of my contribution to Atmos. But I really do think about Atmos when I am recording.
That's great. Yeah, you're giving the mixing team maximum possibilities to use that or not use that as the story dictates, right? Brian, what about you? Favorite Atmos moment?
For me, I hate to be, this is the cheesy answer in a way, but the whistles at the very beginning. I mean, it's such a fun way to start the film. It put a smile on Steven's face every time he heard it, and just as a technical side of things, it always, troubleshooting wise, I would always know if Atmos was working, because it was like, okay, very first sound we're hearing is an Atmos moment. I'm like, okay, cool, we're good.
Yeah, Steven was very much into, Andy first did the whistles, and what's spread out into the sides is spread out along the sides, but we ended up pinpointing it in the way that Atmos allows you to down the side walls. So the whistles come from very discrete locations in the theater. It's very important to Steven from the get-go.
The idea of starting with the whistles was genius, because Steven wanted that sense of the lights would go down essentially, and what I thought was really cool about it was that you felt enveloped right from the very beginning. You knew exactly what you were in for when you heard that opening whistle. And the fun thing was, because it's a call and response, we thought, well, we'll start by having it one side of the room and the response can be on the other side of the room. So I tried it with the normal speakers, and then Steven said to me, how narrow can we make the range? So I narrowed it down a little bit. And he said, what about one speaker? And I said, you know what? Because we're in Dolby Atmos, we can do one speaker. So I literally fine-tuned it down to just coming out of one single speaker on the left, the first call, and then the response, one single speaker over on the right. And then obviously after that, I started to move it around a little bit once the background ambiances started to come in, and we put one down near the front, and then one I think I put right at the very back. And it was such a treat to do. It took quite a while to do, oddly enough. It sounds simple, but it took a while. And Steven and I went through it a few times to try and just get it exactly the way he wanted it to be. But that was the benefit of Dolby Atmos, 100%. And obviously I was aware that once we switched to a different format, it wouldn't have quite that precision feel to the whistle. But it still works really well in 5.1 as well. And there's no question about it. You get a sense. And I've had a lot of reaction, oddly, from people that have said that from that very first whistle, they felt like they were in that world right from the beginning. And that's a really treat to hear people say that. And then obviously once the backgrounds come in and we realize that we're looking at the demolition basically and all the different sounds, but in the middle of that is always those little threads of the percussion coming in, the whistles, the response, a little more percussion, and then of course the orchestra starts to join in and we reveal the guys. So it was a really great sequence to play with, and it took us a while to do to get it the way it is, but I was very happy with it.
It was a remarkably effective way to start that movie. I remember very clearly, I saw it at the Zanuck Theater on the Fox lot, which is a Dolby Atmos room. And those whistles start, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. And I felt like, oh, I'm in this space and I'm where this thing is happening. And it was incredibly effective. Well, gentlemen, any last thoughts? Anything else that you would like to cover that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I will say that it's so. I mean, we were talking earlier about how Shawn has been involved and Todd, and I feel like we were so closer than any other film, in regards to how we all worked together during production, and collaborating with Shawn is something that we never really get to do when he's a scoring mixer, and we were doing that on this, and communicating with Todd, from the get-go was wonderful, and it's just been such a great experience.
You're absolutely right, Brian. I mean, films now, we hardly ever talk, production and post-production. So many films I start, they haven't hired the post-production team yet, so I'm pretty much determining everything, what we're going to do. And I just find that it's a real big void, and it's something, I get it, because of timing, but I think it's a shame.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about West Side Story. I think it's a remarkable film and incredible work on the soundtrack from all of you. So congratulations on your well-deserved Academy Award nomination.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
Thanks, guys. Thank you once again to Gary, Shawn, Brian, Todd, and Andy for speaking with us today about West Side Story. You can stream this new version of West Side Story in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos starting on March 2nd on Disney Plus and HBO Max. You can check out our show notes for links to that. But before you go, please make sure you're subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. In the coming weeks, we are going to bring you more of our Academy Awards coverage, including our individual episodes devoted to entire categories like Best Sound and Best Cinematography. And in the middle of that, we're going to take a slight break and present to you a couple of really exciting conversations with director Matt Reeves and his sound and image team, focusing on the upcoming new film, The Batman. You can find links to our dedicated podcast feed in our show notes, or you can just search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, thanks again for joining us. This has been Sound and Image Lab, the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines. And our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thanks for joining us.